They told me it was for my safety. I found a tiny magnet with a GPS stuck to my car, and it changed everything. The RCMP rang the next morning. That tracker had ridden north on a Canada-bound semi, and an arrest followed. I can still feel the metallic tang under my fingers, the cold bite of the air, my heart knocking like a fist. If you've ever been backstabbed by those closest to you and fantasized about the perfect revenge, subscribe and drop your story in the comments. This one will hit hard. Arthur's photo sits on the mantle. Since he died, I've learned to mind my own affairs. Julian's helpfulness felt comforting at first, the sort that makes you let your guard down. I was due to be away for the weekend, and what should have been ordinary became the hinge on which everything turned. Rain had been falling in a steady, soft ordinance that morning, tapping a slow, thoughtful rhythm against the garage roof. The scent of wet tar mixed with motor oil and the faint, comforting nostalgia of Arthur's old wool coat hanging by the door. Out here, with the car raised and the mechanic's light spilling a narrow rectangle across the concrete, the world felt small and precise, like something you could measure and correct. Grief teaches you two things: how to carry absence and how to inventory the small certainties that remain. I had learned to count in ledgers. Numbers are less treacherous than people. The house still smelled like Arthur, his aftershave in the hallway, his slippers by the fireplace, and the mantle held his photograph, the smile I kept for bad mornings. Sophia had leaned on Julian since the engagement. Their laughter had a particular, practiced warmth, the kind you supply when you intend to keep everything comfortable. He fitted into family photos with the ease of someone who'd practiced placement in a mirror. The garage smelled of solvents and damp rubber. The bonnet wore beads of rain that moved like slow planets toward the grill. Julian's voice was light when he spoke, practiced and easy. "Just a safety check, Mum," he said, smoothing his sleeve like a man who knows the currency of small kindnesses. His tone was polished, reassuring, exactly the sort of gentleness that invites you to stop looking closer. I watched him talk and felt the old reflex. Trust that tone, trust the smile. The world tilts toward those who ask softly. I'd given him the benefit of that tilt. I'd believed in the pleasant fiction that a young man with a steady job and an engaged daughter had no reason to lie. Sophia's eyes always softened around him. She deserved happiness. I wanted to believe. My hand found my handbag out by the passenger seat. Small, sensible, the leather worn in the places my fingers liked to rest. It held a few things: a compact, a pen with Arthur's initials, my passports, and the careful stack of receipts I kept for tax's sake. I went to lift it and the strap snagged. The fall was graceless. The bag tipped, coin and paper dancing out, and something clinked against the gravel. Instinct had me bending before thought. Fingers closed around something cold and flat. There was metal, a tiny weight, a flash of red where an LED blinked faintly like a punished star. For a breath, the garage was smaller still, closer in, claustrophobic. The smell of diesel from a distant delivery truck bled under the door, but that was background now. My fingers felt the ridged edge and a magnet's stubborn pull. This was wrong. Shock arrived as an immediate bright heat behind my ribs. It turned my tongue to bitterness and sharpened the world into angles. I expected to find a lost bolt or a coin. Not this. A small, magnetic rectangle with a glued label and the deliberate hum of electronics. I held it up. The LED blinked again, patient and indifferent. I had the absurd thought that it was beautiful in its engineering, compact and efficient. Then the thought clarified into cold understanding. Someone had been tracking my car. There are two reactions available when trust breaks: a loud, ruinous confrontation and a quiet, surgical response. I have ruined many things in my life by shouting. I have also preserved far more by thinking. Arthur taught me to compose myself. He taught me to measure risk and to let anger settle into plans. My breath narrowed. I tasted metal at the back of my throat. I set the tracker on the car hood and looked at Julian. He watched me as if I had misstepped in a conversation. His smile was ready, the expression of someone waiting for a misunderstanding to be cleared with the smallest of gestures. "Must have fallen off," he said, hands open in that practiced, casual way. His voice was the same safe tone from before. "They're small things, these devices. I asked the mechanic to check the underside just in case." Nice people always have plausible answers. Nice people know the language to lull suspicion. His words pressed on a sore, tender place, my irritation at being treated like a fragile thing. I held the tracker between finger and thumb and let the silence stretch in a deliberate, non-accidental way. The mechanic wiped his hands and peered over, interest genuine but uncomplicated. He had the sort of face that tells you he sees the world in parts that make sense. Nuts, bolts, hoses. That's a GPS magnet, he observed. Used for tracking vehicles, they clamp on and report position. He turned it in his fingers, and I watched the way a man who fixes things treats an object that belongs to another man's designs with an absent sort of reverence. Short sentences came like a drumbeat inside me. Not now. Not here. Think. Move. Do not accuse in the garage. Do not hand the advantage back to whoever planted the thing. I took it with a hand that did not tremble. It was heavier than it looked. Up close, I could see a faded sticker with a serial, a manufacturer's name blurred by abrasion, and a tiny, almost imperceptible scuff like a thumbprint left by hurried fingers. There was no dramatic flourish, no signature. That was the point. Whoever did this collected anonymity like a habit. Leaving the garage would have been the expected action: yell, confront, call the police, cause a scene. There would be anger, there would be statements and tears, and 100 tiny ways Julian could pivot the narrative. He is, after all, practiced in shaping how people see him. I had watched his face in dinners, seen the quickness with which he smoothed concern into the role of protector. He would be able to turn panic into heroism in front of my family, and I would have given him the stage. Instead, I carried the tracker in my palm like a hot coal and drove. My movements were measured, my mind ran through permutations. The semi that would become crucial sat idling on the far side of the depot, a long beast of metal with steam on its breath and a driver sipping coffee in a cab. The driver was a faceless necessity. His route was a line on a map heading north. A semi bound for Canada is an ordinary thing. In my plan, it would become a vessel of misdirection. I approached the truck as if I was simply checking a schedule. Diesel and grease rose up like a scent memory. The driver glanced back at me. An exchange of two strangers with no shared history. He was large and smelled of cigarettes, his jacket thick with the road. "You need something?" he barked, the question more territorial than hospitable. I smiled at him like someone offering a small human courtesy. "Could you do me a favor?" I said. My voice was even. I had rehearsed nothing but the necessary kindness. In my pocket was nothing that could be seen as evidence, just a small, steady purpose. I asked him where the magnet might sit best, somewhere on the belly that his route would carry north, a place the tracker could cling without being noticed. I said it with the casualness of someone who believed in kindness as currency. He grunted and opened the back. I placed the tracker where the steel folded out, in a place he wouldn't think twice about. His truck smelled of coffee and old maps. The magnet stuck with a clean, obedient click. Diesel hissed. He nodded and rolled the door shut, and before I could change my mind, the truck shuddered and pulled out, its horn a low, long note that seemed to cut the rain. I watched it go, the line of light on its side shrinking until it merged with the wet horizon. A strange satisfaction washed through me, cold and precise. Not malice, but the confidence of someone who had saw a discovery into a chess move. I was not naive enough to think one small act had finished anything. It had, however, redirected a thread of a plan that could have been used against me. Driving back home, the rain picked up again, thicker now, as if the sky wanted also to hide motions and choices. I kept the tracker in the glove compartment. Its weight was a reminder against my palm. My thoughts moved like chess pieces, calculating distance, time, and angle. I thought of Arthur and the way he liked things orderly. I thought of the ledger in his handwriting that sat in my office, clean columns, precise dates. He had taught me to be patient, to wait until the second hand found its place before acting. There are fractures that show instantly, and those that are slow to reveal themselves. With Julian, the fracture had the guise of generosity. He had been solicitous about my weekend plans, insistent on safety in a tone that cloaked greed. I had felt it then like a too tight hand on a shoulder. At the time, I had forgiven it as concern. Now I saw the contour of calculation. I pulled into the drive and sat with the engine idling, the house dark and full of the little things grief leaves in its wake. Sophia's photo album on the sideboard, Arthur's mug in the sink, the calendar with my neat, methodical notes. I considered calling her. A direct confrontation would have supplied Julian the theater he craved. Instead, I kept my voice measured in the quiet of the car and let a different strategy take form. Gather evidence, build a frame that did not rely on fury but on facts. Let the facts speak louder than the performance of a man who had rehearsed charm into a weapon. Flashes of memory came. Arthur's voice in the kitchen, his dry humor when a problem demanded patience. "Measure twice, Eleanor, then measure again," he'd say, tapping the corner of a ledger. That phrase anchored me now. Measure, record, wait. I walked into the house with the tracker tucked away and set on the mantel for a moment, placed between Arthur's framed photograph and a small porcelain dish where I kept my keys. To anyone else, it might look like a curious trinket. To me, it was a call to arms. I ran a fingertip along its edge and found, faintly, a scratch that was not from the gravel, but from a deliberate scrape, as if someone had tried to obscure a marking. There was a sticker, partially peeled, with a code that made no immediate sense. I memorized it. That night was long and taut. Sleep came in fits, and every time my eyes closed, I saw the truck's outline on the road and the tiny LED flashing like a heartbeat. I replayed Julian's smile over and over, mapping it to the small, precise act of leaving the tracker on my vehicle. The temptation to send him a message, to confront him with accusation, was almost a physical itch. I resisted. There would be time for words later. For now, calculation. Before I went to bed, I sat in the study with Arthur's ledger open and a cup of tea gone lukewarm at my elbow. I made notes, the serial number, the sticker code, the time I saw the truck leave. I wrote down Julian's words exactly as he had spoken them. I listed the ways he'd been helpful and the moments that had felt like gifts but now posed as possible entry points. My handwriting is methodical. The paper became a map of possibilities. It steadied me. There was a small discovery that closed the chapter of the evening and opened a new doorway. On the inside of the tracker's casing, hidden beneath where the sticker had been, someone had scratched a set of initials and a partial number. It was faint, almost invisible, as if written by fingernail. 2 letters, J-M, then a dash and the start of a sequence. It could have been a coincidence, the dying mark of a previous owner. It could have been nothing. Or it could have been the seed of a pattern. I did not announce this to anyone that night. I placed the tracker back in the glove compartment, wrapped my notes in a folder, and went to bed with the sensation that the house had become both fortress and map. The next morning would require movement, a ledger checked, a call placed, discreet inquiries made. For the first time in months, the world seemed to demand vigilance, not for the sorrow of loss, but for the preservation of what remained. In bed, the rain whispered on the roof, and for a moment I allowed myself a brief, private smile, less for revenge than for reclaiming agency. Grief had been the landscape of my life. It would not be the thing that let others walk through my fields and take what they pleased. The tracker had been meant to shrink me. I would let it be the thread that pulled the truth into the light. The office smelled faintly of burnt coffee and the cheap citrus cleaner the staff used on the countertops. Harold's laptop sat open between us, a small island of light in the late afternoon gloom. Outside the window, the sky had the flat, polite gray of early autumn. Inside, the light from the screen made his face look like an illuminated manuscript. He tapped keys with a businesslike rhythm, soft clacks that filled the room like a metronome. Steam rose from his cup and blurred one corner of the spreadsheet. Numbers are honest in ways people are not. They don't make promises they can't keep. Harold scrolled and scrolled, the columns unfolding in long, impartial rows. "Look at this," he said without a tremor. His voice was the voice of someone used to finding order in chaos. He set the laptop toward me and pointed with a stubby, efficient finger. The entries looked innocent at first. Small amounts, familiar names, dates that slid by as if they were nothing. Then the pattern emerged. An archipelago of withdrawals, each one small enough to be overlooked, frequent enough to become a map. $2,500 here, $1,200 there. dates that matched grocery runs and salon visits. The sums added silently, like a tide. Harold's cursor traced a summer of transactions and then stopped. He inhaled and the room seemed to constrict. $37,000, he said. The sentence landed flat between us. I felt the numbers like a blow to the sternum. My pulse climbed, not with panic, but with the hot, mechanical fury that comes when something precious is covertly pried from your hands. Short sentences now, not yet. Wait. Measure. I read the entries again, this time aloud because speech makes things real. June 28th, July 3rd, August 2nd, small transfers to a set of accounts. Harold's fingers hovered over the keyboard, then began to click again, slower. The clack of his keys was a kind of percussion that steadied my attention. Coffee cooled beside him. He ignored it. He called up the descriptions attached to each withdrawal, and my eyes snagged on a recurring note. Service fee, personal expense, consultation. Euphemisms for taking. How long has this been going on, I asked, and my voice sounded far away in my own ears. Harold adjusted his glasses. About a year, maybe more. The pattern's recent enough to show up on monthly reconciliations, but it was small enough to fly under the radar because the withdrawals were disguised as routine charges. He tapped a few more keys and highlighted a cluster of dates. See here, consistent weekly extractions matched to days you usually have lunches or appointments. He pointed to a line, and suddenly the ledger felt like a ledger of betrayals instead of balances. Fury and calculation tangled inside me. Heat rose to my neck, my hands remained still. Anger flared, bright, instantaneous, but I wrapped it quickly in a cloak of method. Anger is useful when directed. It is destructive when left to run. I tasted rage and steered it toward evidence gathering instead of confrontation. Harold leaned back and folded his hands. He had been my accountant for years, and his respect for numbers made him blunt when he needed to be. These transfers aren't just random, he said. They're routed through shell accounts, often with different names. Look at these pays. They're alternately businesses that don't match the service descriptions and individuals with P.O. boxes as addresses. Paper scent rose as he printed the reports. Ink and a faint chemical tang. The printer whirred, a bureaucratic insect, and paper drifted from its mouth like pale flags. I took the first sheet and felt the texture between my fingers, as if it were a talisman. Harold kept working, eyes never leaving the screen. There are forged receipts here, he added. See these vendor references? They don't exist on file with the banks. Someone fabricated invoices to justify withdrawals. The words landed hard. Forged receipts. The idea made my skin crawl. I pictured a hand handwriting slanted notes, a man turning to fraud as casually as changing a shirt. The sensation was cold and precise, like running a finger along the edge of a blade. I let the thought settle and began to dissect what it meant. Someone close had learned my rhythms, my lunch schedule, my weekly errands, the days I left town. They had used that knowledge like a key. Harold's brow furrowed. He clicked through more transactions, calling out numbers in that flat tone that makes the gravity of a situation unavoidable. June 5th, transfer to account ending in 924, July 12th P.O., box 461 at the downtown postal center, August 29th, vendor code A17, no registered company. The ledger became a constellation. My pulse thudded, steady but louder now. Each figure tightened the narrative. Short sentences, breathe, plan. I asked Harold to trace the withdrawals back to originating terminals and times. He obliged, the screen filling with timestamps and IP addresses that read like a geography of intrusion. One transfer routed through an online payment provider, tied to a terminal at a convenience store 2 blocks from the downtown postal hub. Another lined up with a morning when I had forgotten to pick up mail. Small coincidences compiled into a case file that felt far too deliberate. The internal voice, sharp, unyielding, poked and prodded. How many people knew I carried cash on certain days? Who had keys? Who visited without leaving a mark? My memories of small kindnesses from Julian now bore the shadow of motive. I replayed his hands, smoothing his sleeve, his practiced tone. The details were not proof, but they were tiles in a mosaic. Harold set the printouts in a neat stack and folded his hands. He was not given to melodrama. "We need corroboration," he said. Statements, CCTV from the merchants, the postal box logins, and most importantly, look for patterns, recipients with recurring PO boxes, names that don't correspond to current businesses. I can subpoena some records, but that takes time. He paused and studied my face. If this is internal, we need legal counsel before we make any moves. The word legal shifted the plan from private irritation to a procedural trajectory. I pictured headlines in a local paper, the messy publicity that could make a private matter public. The idea of immediate action, storming into dinner and accusing, was still tempting. But I was old enough to know that theatrics hand advantage to the quick and practiced deceiver. My internal monologue became surgical. Evidence first, protect the accounts, document everything, keep Sophia from learning until we had more than suspicion. People are suggestible. Accusation without proof can spiral into denial and excuses, and a practiced liar can create counter-narratives that seduce even the skeptical. I asked Harold to compile a timeline and to flag any beneficiaries that used P.O. boxes. He ran a query, and as if confirming a whispered suspicion, a P.O. box number popped up multiple times across months, each appearance correlated with a withdrawal. The room felt colder by degrees. The printer whirred again, producing a sheet with names, dates, and the telltale P.O. box address. It read like a breadcrumb trail, and someone had expected it to be swallowed by the mundane churn of bills. They had not counted on me noticing. Is it possible they're laundering through multiple accounts? I asked. Harold's eyes crinkled. Absolutely, layering is classic, small withdrawals, multiple accounts, offshore transfers if they can, but this pattern is domestic and hands-on. Someone is physically moving money through the system. He tapped a line where a vendor name matched a legitimate business, but the registration number didn't. This vendor doesn't exist according to the Federal Registry. It's a front. Paper sent again. Ink. The tangible proof made the abstract crime real. I felt the room contract around me and then expand into a plan. Quietly, deliberately, I began to assemble the pieces of a team in my head. Someone to navigate law, someone to parse surveillance, someone to trace the financial breadcrumbs to their source. Each role corresponded to a person I already knew. Susan Martinez was first, sharp, efficient, and not given to theatrics. Her legal practice specialized in elder fraud and estate law, a cruel irony she'd embraced professionally. Her voice in meetings was the voice of someone comfortable steering storms. I imagined her reading the printouts and mapping legal vectors with the same clinical curiosity Harold used with numbers. Then, Marcus Webb, the retired FBI agent. He had the kind of steady presence that made people inclined to tell the truth and the context to obtain surveillance footage and storage unit logs. Marcus had a way of remaining invisible in a room while still absorbing everything. If there were meetings in the dead of night or a storage locker that smelled of other people's lives, he would find them. I closed my eyes and allowed myself the luxury of a slow smile, not from satisfaction, but from the clarity of motion. There was an order in all this that felt oddly like relief, evidence, counsel, surveillance, then confrontation. I would not be baited into a moment that Julian could frame into heroism. I would instead let cold facts speak and let law do its patient work. But before the team could be assembled, there was the small, sharp moment that changed the axis of suspicion into something tangible. Among the vendor files Harold had flagged was an address attached to a PO. Box not in my city, but in a regional mail hub used by multiple businesses. Harold frowned and cross-referenced it with a payment terminal location. A transfer made the morning of a dentist appointment corresponded to a morning when I had stopped to deposit a check at the downtown branch. The transaction's metadata referenced a registering IP that resolved to a postal kiosk terminal. That P.O. box, Harold said. Someone's using mail drops to distance the transfers from their real identity. He printed the postal log and set it before me. The entry was curt. Box number, date of activation, and a tiny notation indicating a key pickup. The handwriting beside the entry was different from the official stamp, as if someone at the counter had scrawled a note. I felt a chill not from the air, but from the recognition that whoever had done this had thought to create layers. I kept my voice even. Can you trace where the key was issued from? Harold nodded and frowned at his screen. We can file a request, he said, but I'd rather we have counsel handle that. If we move too fast, we alert whoever's behind it." He tapped the keyboard and summarized the transactions into a neat packet. The cliffhanger grew teeth when Harold pointed to a transaction on a day I'd been out of town. "This payment was made when you were away," he said. "That means someone had access to your account details without you being present." The implication was direct. Not only was money being siphoned, but information about my comings and goings was being used to time withdrawals. The hand that robbed the ledger knew my calendar. I exhaled and felt the tension migrate from my chest into my hands, where it became purpose. The decision point had arrived. This was no longer about curiosity or even outrage. It was about assembling a team capable of following a trail that wound through financial systems, P.O. boxes, and human deceit. I would recruit Susan for the legal muscle and Marcus to chase the physical evidence. We would gather Jennifer for forensic accounting if needed. But first, caution. We would not summon Sophia into this theater. I needed a stable set of facts before any family upheaval. Harold closed his laptop with a soft click and handed me a thick packet of printed pages. "I'll keep digging," he said. "I'll flag any more anomalies and start preparing subpoenas. But talk to Susan first. She'll want a copy of everything." He pushed the folder toward me like a baton, and I took it as if accepting a challenge. The coffee steam curled between us, and the afternoon light thinned into early evening, casting long shadows across the desk. I felt oddly calm. The outrage had been reshaped into a strategy. Numbers had revealed the theft's shape, and now people would reveal the hands behind them. The P.O. box link was the hinge. Uncovering who collected that mail would open doors. My ledger, Arthur's lessons, Harold's steady hands, and my own refusal to be diminished all converged into a plan as precise as any I had written in ledgers. I left the office with the packet under my arm and a sense of movement that steadied me. The rain had begun again. The city glossed with light. Each step felt measured. The first waves of deception had been exposed. The next moves required patience, precision, and the right people to turn odd transactions into incontrovertible proof. Grainy black and white footage stuttered across the laptop screen, each frame a small, imperfect truth. Streetlights smeared like wet paint, headlights cut through drizzle. A shadow moved in and out of view, the figure small against the orange glow of a parking lot. My hands trembled as I watched. The tremor was muscle memory from nights spent drafting check entries, but tonight it felt like something else, fear braided with a tightening focus. I was learning to read movement the way I once read balance sheets, look for irregularities, note repetition, follow the rhythm until the pattern emerges. Marcus had a talent for finding rhythm in chaos. He sat beside me, quiet, cigarette stub between his fingers, though he'd sworn he'd quit years ago. He watched the footage as if he were reconstructing a story frame by frame, and when he spoke, it was in the calm, measured tones of someone used to interrogating facts rather than people. "There," he said, his finger landing on a paused frame. "Storage unit 508, same time 3 different nights, someone's dropping off packages." The late-night stakeouts had been arranged with the kind of clinical precision that made the absurd feel pragmatic. Cameras hidden in shrubs, an observer parked across the street with a thermos, the hum of a distant highway. I watched as Marcus ran segments, A to B to the storage facility, each jump stitched together by a thin thread of surveillance. The image quality was poor, but it was enough. Enough to see the way a man moved, the way his shoulders tightened when he thought someone might be watching. Enough to catch the length of a jacket, the gait, the hesitation that betrays someone who expects to be invisible. There are times when watching ruins you. Bad footage loops like a nightmare. But there are also times when it heals, when each detail you catalog becomes a stitch that repairs a ragged edge. My pulse was loud, but I placed a hand over it and let Marcus narrate in his low voice. He pointed out license plate fragments, angular smudges that, when enhanced, resolved into partial numbers. He mapped timestamps against my calendar and against the odd days Harold had highlighted. Correlation is not proof, but it is a road toward it. The surveillance showed visits to storage units during hours, when Julian claimed to be at financial seminars or at the office late. Men who looked like courier shadows unloaded small boxes. Nothing that screamed drama, but items packaged with the sort of secrecy that suggested intent. The stale air of those corridors seemed to seep through the screen. Fluorescents buzzed, echoing a fluorescent light I could almost smell, like overheated plastic and dust motes that had been there for years. Marcus said nothing about my feelings. He handed me facts. Jennifer was methodical in a way that could make you forget the human cost behind the columns she traced. When she came, she brought a kind of forensic light to money. The way she described touch points made dollars sound like a trail of footprints. She had a ledger of other victims' cases on her tablet, names like a litany, each followed by the same punctuation. Whispered loneliness, a man with a practiced smile, accounts drained in increments. She spoke softly, but the implications of her words were glacial. She uses the same cadence as the other cases, Jennifer told me, the fluorescent light catching the rims of her glasses. Not the same man necessarily, but the same method. Establish trust, suggest safety, move slowly, small withdrawals, so no bells ring. Her voice hardened at the last syllable. She drummed her fingers on the table, and I watched the way her mouth pinched when she found an anomaly she liked. Victims often report the same pattern of behavioral grooming. He isolates the target emotionally while he tests the accounts financially. I asked for specifics, and she provided names. Older women in other states who woke one morning to find little things missing and later discovered assets shifted. She showed screenshots of messages, strings of benign concern that read like kindness until you saw the endgame. Each case had bruises of betrayal in the same places, invitations to dinners, access to calendars, requests to sign forms under the guise of convenience. The parallels chilled me because they translated into a rule. This was not a random theft, but a practiced architecture of deception. I caught my own reflection in the laptop screen and for a moment did not recognize myself. Older, more composed, eyes bright with a purpose that astonished even me. I had been vulnerable, yes, a fact as plain as the wedding photo on the mantle, but vulnerability is not always weakness. It is also a place where predators look first. Jennifer's work was to translate those locations of vulnerability into forensically useful threads. She highlighted bank routes, flagged aliases, and matched transaction styles to those used in other cases. There was a rhythm to their picking, small, seemingly sensible charges that added up. We followed one thread to a storage facility on the edge of town. The corridors smelled of stale air and cold metal. Fluorescent tubes hummed overhead. The unit doors were corrugated sheets of color, each labeled with numbers that had no face. Marcus got a warrant after he and Jennifer put together enough circumstantial evidence for one. The moment the bolt slid and the door peeled up, the stale, dry smell of packing tape and dust spilled out. Boxes nested inside boxes, each layer a secrecy wrapped in paper like some ritual object. There were binders, shipping receipts with partial names and smudged ink, and a weathered passport stamped in places that made my throat catch. A photograph of a woman, folded into a wallet in that clutter, her face familiar because I'd seen similar images in Jennifer's case notes, lay under a stack of styrofoam. It felt like opening a wound and finding an entire operation unfolding. Marcus handled the physical evidence with a steady hand, bagging receipts, photographing labels, annotating with the thoroughness of someone who had been a step ahead his whole career. The stale air of the corridors clung to me like a sentiment I could not shake. Fluorescent light made everything look sharper and more accusing. Then the call came. It arrived as a ring I knew would change the shape of the night. Thin, persistent, impossible to ignore. Marcus answered with a clipped greeting and then straightened. He gestured for me to step back. "It's the RCMP," he said. "There's been an arrest in Alberta." My breath hitched and the room narrowed to his face. The call confirmed something I had been too careful to hope for. The tracker on the semi had not been merely mislaid in my plan. It had done its work. Vincent Torres, a man with a record of petty jobs and bigger delusions, had been detained in a small hotel outside Calgary. They found in his possession a photo of me, a notebook with surveillance notes, and a set of instructions that used initials, a shorthand that matched the ones faintly etched beneath the sticker on the tracker I'd found. "You're sure?" My voice sounded small and incredulous. Marcus nodded. "He's got detailed logs. He confessed to being hired. He named a client. The syllables fell like pebbles and made circles. He said the initials, JM, and the air left my chest for a second as if someone had pried the breath out. Hearing that 2 letters aloud undid a knot of fear and knitted a new web of resolve. The world narrowed to that naming JM. It could be coincidence, a misdirection, a red herring planted by someone skilled in obfuscation. Or it could be exactly what I had feared. The initials of the man who stood in my living room, smiling politely while pocketing strategies for plunder. The RCMP's notes were meticulous. Torres had been found with a stack of surveillance photos annotated with times and positions, names and routes. There were phone numbers and a list of panic responses to be used in a virtual kidnapping scenario, instructions to call relatives, demand ransom, and orchestrate a spectacle that would culminate in the supposed rescuer's heroics. It was obscene in its calculation. The lawman read parts aloud, the mundane voice of procedure making the horror feel even more clinical. Hearing the details, I felt shock in the way of someone who is simultaneously observer and participant. Images of Sophia's face the night she announced the engagement flashed through my mind, smiles and plans and the small trust a mother gives. I thought of the dinners where Julian had sat close and listened, gathering the cadence of our lives the way a composer collects melodies. The notion of someone using theatrical panic to manipulate us made my skin crawl. Susan, when I told her, did not flinch. She folded the paper into a precise square with the practiced hand of a lawyer. Her brain moved quickly to options, to tactical choices. "We have leverage now," she said. "An arrested intermediary who's admitted involvement and a file that links to your car. The question is what we do next without letting him reconstruct the story and become a martyr in front of your family." Her eyes were clear, not unkind, but determined. We discussed legal avenues with a tone like people planning a complex voyage. She advised me on what it would mean to subpoena records, on how to preserve chain of custody for the tracker, and the printed materials from the storage unit. "We should consider seeking a preservation order for bank records and cell phone metadata," she said. "If Torres names a handler and gives us numbers, we can trace the communications, but do not inform Sophia until we have more confirmed facts. Emotional reactions can undermine a legal case." Each legal term she spoke was a tool, a chisel for the marble of truth. I listened and felt the architecture of a plan rising. Collect documents, secure testimony, maintain secrecy. Susan outlined ways to make a confrontation controlled, police on standby, arrest warrants ready, and a public narrative that would not allow Julian space to perform the savior. She spoke of timing and optics, of how the law could frame truth in a way that neutralized charm. Marcus and Jennifer filled in the practicalities. Marcus had already pulled anonymized footage from several CCTV feeds and was cross-referencing plate numbers with the snippets we'd extracted. Jennifer had pulled victims' files that matched the profile and was mapping a network of similar incidents across states. "He's not just opportunistic," Jennifer said, her voice threaded with a tired anger. "This is method. Our job is to make it unworkable." As we plotted, the legal and investigative elements moved like gears. There was an odd intimacy in the room, 4 minds locked into a shared architecture of truth. We spoke in low tones, a hush like a chapel, as if volume could break the fragile secrecy we were preserving. Each small fact was a drumbeat: the arrested man's confessions, the notebook with my photograph, the initials. Each fact increased the probability that what we suspected was not a fantasy, but a design. There was also a private calculation I kept folded beneath the professional. Even as we mapped subpoenas and warrants, I was considering the emotional architecture of the upcoming confrontation. Sophia had a right to know. She had a right to be spared the trauma of a staged kidnapping, but she also had a right to hear, when the truth came, that her mother had acted to protect her and to preserve the integrity of the case. Susan's words echoed in my head. Control the narrative, control the outcome. At one point, Marcus turned to me and said, "You did exactly the right thing with the tracker. Sending it on that semi bought us a trail." His voice was dry, almost grudging in its admiration. I felt a brief, private surge of vindication, not for the entrapment, but for the confirmation that measured action could have reach. The tracker had been a small piece in a larger ledger, and now the ledger was beginning to balance. The arrest in Alberta was the hinge on which the investigation swung from hypothesis toward reality. With Torres in custody, and a notebook full of details, the path forward was clearer, though no less fraught. We had names, initials, and a record of intent. We had evidence enough to begin assembling a case that might strip away the masks Julian wore so well. Plans formed in the hush between us: preserve records quietly, secure testimony, and prepare for the eventual confrontation with the weight of law behind it. Susan sketched out a timeline, and I felt the weight of each day like a coin in my hand. Careful, measured. The investigation had deepened, and in that depth I found a kind of resolve that steadied me. The work ahead would be long and uncompromising, but the ledger of deceit had begun to be rewritten in ink that could not be smudged. The dining room felt like a small theater, every surface rehearsed and waiting for its cue. Candlelight softened the corners of the room. A long linen cloth lay smooth across the table, its weave cool under my palms when I smoothed it one last time. Silverware caught the flames and threw them back in quick, honest flashes. The plates were set with a precise calm, no fussy flourishes, only things that read as familiar and respectable. In the center, a low arrangement of white blooms kept the sightline clean, so faces would be visible, the sort of detail that lets everyone pretend nothing important is about to happen. I had sent invitations that sounded ordinary: a celebratory dinner for the engagement, an evening to meet family and close friends. No one suspected the careful choreography behind the domestic language. The menu was intentionally comforting: roast lamb with rosemary, a bright bean salad, a lemon tart that tasted of summers we had lost. Food settles nerves, it anchors people to routine. I wanted the room to feel like a homecoming rather than a courtroom. Guests would come relaxed, and that ease would be the soft skin under which truth could surface. Police placement was surgical, coordinated in whispers over encrypted lines. Officers would be on my property, but out of sight, parked across the street in unmarked cars. A small contingent stationed by the garden gate. A pair of detectives would sit in a waiting car with radios quieted, a sergeant with a warrant tucked in his jacket. They would step forward only when the evidence was clear and the moment ordained. The last thing I wanted was a spectacle that would allow Julian to perform crisis management and win sympathy. The law would be the frame that refused stagecraft. In the kitchen, the tablecloth's texture whispered as I adjusted its hem, the linen fibers catching the candlelight, and the faint scent of lemon oil from my hands. I lit the candles slowly, one by one, listening to the small hiss as wax kissed flame. The clink of cutlery during the rehearsal run sounded like a metronome in my head. I practiced my posture in the reflection of the sideboard, coaxing the right mixture of warmth and reserve. Performance and patience were the twin virtues for the evening. I had to look like the benign host while holding a script only a few of us would know. There was a packet for Julian placed in a nondescript folder and slipped under the salad plate where it would not be seen at first glance, but could be produced with the lethargic casualness of someone showing family documents. Inside, printouts of bank transfers, highlighted lines that tied P.O. boxes to suspicious beneficiaries, a few photographed pages from the storage unit inventory. Another envelope contained a copy of the RCMP notes, redactions where necessary, arranged to show pattern without revealing investigative preserves. Each packet was an island of evidence made intentionally domestic, meant to read as family paperwork until I chose otherwise. I placed a tiny digital recorder, one of those pen-sized things that looks perfectly innocuous, beneath a napkin where it would pick up conversations. It was positioned to capture the table's center, the way voices would arc and overlap over wine. My questions had been refined into measured lines, the kind that sound like curiosity rather than accusation. Tell me about the service someone did on the car, I practiced aloud, not for rehearsal, but to taste how Julian might parry. Who recommended the mechanic? Would come later, soft and easy. The trick was to ask the right small things that would cause him to drop a guard without signaling the net I had laid. I wrote the opening lines on a slim sheet, neutral, unhurried. That maintenance you mentioned, did the mechanic find anything unusual? And if his confidence surfaced, did you make any arrangements yourself? My voice would be gentle. The subtext was a blade hidden in a velvet glove. Dialogue practice was not about trickery for its own sake. It was about steering a performance toward truth. A practiced liar relies on cadence. A prepared truth teller uses timing. Sophia arrived first, her face bright with hope. She moved through the room like someone stepping into a memory she'd planned for months. She touched my arm in the old way, eyes shining, and for a moment I allowed myself to be the mother who had watched her grow into this life. Julian followed with the ease of someone who knows he has rehearsed charm into a second skin. His smile was smooth. He placed a hand at the small of Sophia's back with that practiced possessiveness that reads like protection until you know it is possession. He greeted guests with the polished phrases of someone who understands optics. He laughed where appropriate and nodded where sorrow or joy required it. His hands were steady, his jaw immaculately shaven, his suit fitted as if cut from a catalog that sells success. Watching him, I felt the old ache of betrayal stir, quickly dampened by the cool calculus that had become my mode. I welcomed him, poured wine with deliberate slowness, and listened as he wove himself back into the fabric of the evening. The more he performed, the more obvious his reliance on theater became. Dinner began with gentle conversation, the kind that warms a room, talk about a venue for the wedding, opinions on the salad dressing, a joke about Arthur's dreadful penchant for burnt toast. I steered the talk with a nonchalant ease, the questions I had practiced slipping into the rhythm. My voice was steady, the sort of calm that keeps a tide from turning into a storm. We lingered over the lamb, the fork's movement crisp and domestic. The candlelight made each face familiar, safe-looking. My gaze found Julian and held him with a quiet patience that was hard to read. I let him talk. I let him fill in spaces. Predators are at their most comfortable when they believe the hunt is hidden. At an opportune moment, I drew out a folder as if it contained copies of family itineraries. I let it rest on the table, a soft presence that would not enforce but invite curiosity. My hand brushed the edge of the paper with the practiced casualness of someone handling a household bill. "You mentioned the mechanic handled a precaution," I said lightly. "Everyone's been curious. What did they say?" The question was innocent enough in form, deliberate in intent. Julian's smile cooled, fractionally. He met my eyes with the same polished confidence. He answered with that smooth cadence he used so well, speaking of safety and diligence and how he'd simply wanted my trip to be carefree. His words were tidy. They were the sort of phrases that paper over discomfort. I listened, then let one of the detectives, positioned out of sight but ready, signal through the subtle tap of a radio. The moment had to feel natural, not orchestrated by visible forces. The law's presence was to be a quiet assurance rather than an overt intervention. As courses progressed, I moved the conversation with slow, exact prompts. "Were you the one to set up the checks?" I asked, eyes level, voice steady. "Did anyone else know where the car would be left?" These were small things, the kind of casual curiosities that might prompt a slip. A practiced liar rehearses misdirection. He rarely plans for direct, quiet queries that pry at the seams of that misdirection. Julian's charm was on display, but there was a noticeability to the way it trembled when lightly prodded. I could see the micro-expressions, the tightening around the mouth, the slight hesitation, that betray a man forced to account for the scaffolding he'd built. Sophia, blissfully unaware of the edges beneath the polish, laughed at a joke, and the sound momentarily shifted the room's energy to warmth. That warmth made the later fall of truth all the sharper. Small sensory details became our punctuation. The clatter of cutlery as a guest reached for bread, the low murmur of voices filling in silence, the scent of lemon tart drifting like a soft apology. At one point, a fork slipped from an elderly aunt's hand and hit the plate with an ungainly metallic ring that cut through the conversation like a dropped cue. Heads turned. The silence that followed was not empty. It was charged, expectant. In that hush, the balance of power shifted minutely. Julian's hand tightened around his glass. I kept my face an island of calm. Right then, Julian's phone buzzed. a sound like a small insect, and the room's rhythm stuttered. He glanced at the screen, his brow knitting for the briefest moment, and then rose with a practiced apology about taking a quick call. He stepped into the hallway, the door clicking softly behind him. His departure was the cliffhanger I had been patient for. It gave the rest of us a sliver of time to calibrate. He was gone exactly long enough to let a sliver of the outside world fold into the domestic light. Through the cracked door, I heard the muffled murmur of voices, and then the abrupt edge of his voice raised for a moment, sharp, defensive, before the hallway swallowed the sound. When he returned, his face had a different quality. The practiced charm was intact, but there was a shallower line beneath his smile. In his exit, he had taken a secret with him. In his re-entry, he had brought back the faint stain of panic. That phone call was the fault line. Moments later, a soft knock at the back gate, prearranged, a signal for the officers, set the next phase into motion. The detectives moved with a silent, rehearsed coordination, two shadows crossing the lawn, boots that made no unnecessary noise, radios clipped low. I watched them align at the edges, their presence like a frame that would make the painting visible only when the curtain was pulled. The net tightening felt like a hand closing with deliberate gentleness. Officers eased into positions visible only to those trained to see them. A car headlight's low beam slant, a figure by the lane, a pair at the garden wall. The hunger in my chest, the old animal thing, eased into a measured steadiness. This was the moment where procedure and patience met. All the planning, the evidence gathered and arranged, the recordings set to capture, and the legal path Susan had sketched became a choreography of small, precise motions. I sat with a glass of wine that I did not drink, feeling the stem cool against my fingers. The room hummed with normal conversation, laughter that had not yet learned the new music of truth. My eyes never left Julian. He was answering questions with that practiced facility, unaware, or choosing to be unaware, of the law's patient presence waiting in the wings. The officers watched his micro-movements, the way his hand brushed his pocket, the cadence of his breathing. Each small tick was a possibility, a potential unraveling. Then, with a quietness that felt perfect, I placed the packet before him and slid it across the table as if offering a family keepsake. "We found some oddities," I said, my voice flat with the calm of someone who has held a plan like a creature and knows its rhythms. "Pages I thought you might like to look at." In that line, I let the world tilt just an inch toward disclosure. His face briefly read confusion. He reached for the folder with a casualness that insisted he was above suspicion. The edges of the envelope were crisp, the contents legal and methodical. Susan's presence at an adjacent seat made her eyes briefly meet mine with the kind of look that says, "We are ready." The officers tensed. The room exhaled and waited for the first move in a game that had been arranged long before the candlelight began. He opened the folder and began to scan. His smile thinned. For a moment, the man who had smoothed conversation with ease found himself in a script that required more improvisation than he possessed. Small details, dates, signatures, the RCMP notes tucked within, did what paper does best. They make pretense feel absurdly flimsy. The dinner hummed, and the candles burned down a little, unnoticed. The reveal was not a thunderclap, but a series of soft admissions that would, with the proper nudge, pile into confession. Outside, the detectives shifted into a narrower alignment. The timing was precise. The law should never be shouted, but should act when the stage is set and the audience is arrested by clarity. I rested my hands on the table's edge and felt the linens weave under my fingertips, grounding me in the ordinary as the extraordinary, prepared to unfold. The moment before the reveal is always strange, full of small, delicate breaths that carry the weight of consequence, and I savored it with the careful, exact patience that had brought me here. The moment the folder lay open in front of him, the room thinned to a sharp, trembling silence. Candlelight flickered across the pages, bank statements, GPS photographs, the RCMP summary, and the shadows on his face moved in slow, startled waves. I could see his eyes flick to the highlighted dates, the list of withdrawals, the Canadian arrest notes. His fingers tightened around the edge of the paper. His smile, usually so smooth and deliberate, tried to lift again but rose only halfway before collapsing into something brittle. I placed the small GPS device on the table with a soft click. Its metal body caught the candle flame like an accusation made of steel. "This was on my car," I said, my voice calm, evenly cut. "And this," I continued, sliding forward the RCMP printout, "is what your hired man had in his pocket when he was arrested in Alberta. My photo, my itinerary, my name written 3 times. He inhaled sharply, shoulders lifting as though he'd been punched under the ribs. Sophia turned towards him, confusion spreading across her features like ink sinking into paper. "Julian?" she whispered, her voice breaking on the second syllable. He gave her a fleeting glance, then looked back at me with a thin, cracked veneer of indignation. "This is absurd," he said, but the words trembled, ending on a frayed edge. I read a line aloud from the RCMP report. Subject Vincent Torres states he was contracted by JM to intercept the victim for a staged kidnapping. My tone was level, unembellished. "You picked your own initials, Derek, or were you hoping she'd think it was some anonymous mistake?" The name Derek landed between us with the force of a stone dropped into still water. He froze, his lashes fluttered, the mask fell off him piece by piece. First the eyes, then the jaw, then the shoulders as they sagged into the shape of a cornered man. He stared at the tracker as though it had grown teeth. "You don't understand," he murmured, a plea beginning to form, but too late, too weak. The light caught the sheen of sweat forming at his temple. Each breath he drew seemed to take more effort, dragging through the tension thickening the room. Sophia rose from her chair, her fingers trembling against the tablecloth. "Tell me this isn't real," she begged. "Tell me you didn't do this." He opened his mouth to lie. I watched his throat work. Then the lie died before the breath fully formed. His face folded into a contorted mixture of panic and calculation. The performance he relied on for so long simply failed him. There was no more mask to wear. When he shot up from the table, the chairs clattered backward. The candles trembled. He bolted for the hallway, knocking his shoulder against the wall in his haste. His breath was ragged before he reached the back door. I followed at a measured pace, hearing his hurried steps on the tile, then the creak of the screen door bursting open. Outside, night air rushed in, cold and sharp. He sprinted across the lawn, shoes slipping on the damp grass. The earth softened beneath each panicked step. Gravel scattered behind him as he stumbled toward the back fence. Officers emerged from the shadows, silent shapes turning solid. "Stop," one commanded, but he didn't. His breath tore from him in uneven bursts. His hands clawed at the fence as if splinters and desperation could save him. The officers moved fast. 2 cut him off from the right. A third reached him from behind. Gravel crunched loud under the struggle, the sound jolting through the quiet neighborhood. He twisted, tried to wrench free, but his footing gave way and he fell hard onto the cold ground. His face hit the dirt with a muted thud, and the officers pinned him with swift, disciplined motions. His shouts escalated into wild accusations, spit flying into the night air. "She's involved! She planned it with me! She's my accomplice!" he screamed, voice shredding with hysteria. Sophia, who had followed me to the doorway, collapsed onto the step, her breath punching out of her chest in sharp sobs. "No!" she whispered, shaking her head over and over. I placed a hand on her shoulder, steady, grounding. "You're safe," I said softly, even as my pulse hammered against my ribs. "It's over." But it wasn't over. Not yet. His accusation echoed long after the officers pulled him up from the dirt and marched him toward the patrol car. The flashing lights pulsed against his face, painting him in stark, alternating slices of red and white. His chest heaved, his eyes darted wildly between me and the officers as though searching for a foothold in a crumbling world. The door slammed shut with a heavy, decisive thump, and the car pulled away into the night. The trial began months later, a cold, polished room filled with observers who whispered among themselves about the handsome financial planner who'd been unmasked. He entered in shackles, hair unkempt, eyes carrying a hollow, fractured gleam. When he looked at me, his expression flickered between hatred and desperation, as if he still believed he could pull me down with him. His testimony was a spectacle of self-destruction. To insist I was his accomplice, he had to explain the very crimes he hoped to hide. He described transactions, account diversions, and forged signatures. He outlined how he had recruited Torres, how he planned the staged kidnapping, how he would rescue me at just the right moment to secure sympathy and money. Each detail meant to implicate me instead tied a noose around his own case. Prosecutors presented the broader pattern uncovered by Jennifer and Marcus: elderly widows bankrupted, insurance payouts rerouted, a trail of fraud across state lines. They showed the photos of the storage unit contents, the emergency passport hidden in a metal box, the list of beneficiaries who didn't exist. I watched from my seat as his history unfolded like a ledger of predators and ruin. The courtroom buzzed faintly with the hum of fluorescent lights, the shuffle of papers, the quiet tapping of keys as the stenographer's fingers moved in quick, authoritative strokes. The prosecutor's closing argument was delivered with a steady cadence that rang through the courtroom like a metronome of truth. Each sentence built upon the last, drawing a line from every victim to the man sitting taut and trembling at the defense table. When the judge finally lifted the gavel, the sound cracked through the room with the weight of a verdict long overdue. Sentencing was handed down with a solemn clarity: 28 years in federal prison with full restitution ordered. The judge read each word slowly, ensuring every syllable landed with the exact severity intended. Julian, Derek, stared ahead, blinking rapidly as though the reality of his future had become too heavy to hold in his mind. I felt no triumph in that moment. Only a steady, quiet closure. His downfall wasn't mine to gloat over. It was the inevitable result of a path he carved with greed and cruelty. Sophia sat beside me, hands clasped tightly around mine, her tears falling silently. The sharp pain she once carried had softened into something resolute. When the courtroom emptied, I stood for a long moment, absorbing the stillness. The scent of old wood, the last echo of the gavel, the sense of an era ending, not with victory, but with release. I walked out into the daylight, feeling a calm I had not known in years. The world did not feel lighter, it felt truer. The center's ribbon felt heavier than I expected when I cut it, braided navy silk, cool against my fingers, because weight is not always about metal, but about what it carries. The Eleanor Vance Center sits on a quiet corner that used to be an empty lot where Arthur and I once fed pigeons. Now, the plaque on the front wall is metal, slightly raised letters you can trace with your thumb. Eleanor Vance Center for Elder Fraud Prevention. The letters catch the sun just so. Sophia runs programs there. She wakes with a purpose I hadn't seen since before this began. Watching her lead a workshop, seeing the way older faces relax when she speaks, is better than any sentence handed down in a courtroom. Founding the center wasn't about triumph. It was about turning what was taken into something that protects others. Restitution paid for scholarships and a hotline. Part of the office is a small library full of ledgers and legal guides because knowledge is the first armor. I walk those rooms and feel Arthur's old lessons, measure, record, weight, resonating in new work. The plaque's cool metal under my fingers is a promise, not vengeance for spectacle, but prevention that endures. If this revenge saga gave you that rush of justice, smash like, subscribe for more epic tales, and share your revenge story in the comments. Click the next video box for another one.